So just to introduce myself very briefly, my name is Jean-Christophe, but I go by JC. And so I'm a trainer, speaker, and Search Inside Yourself teacher. Search Inside Yourself, which is the mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and leadership program developed by Google and based on neuroscience. And usually when I tell my story, I talk about the time when I was a young leader and I had to deal with a dysfunctional work culture, which brought me to the domain of emotional intelligence. But in every story, there are different layers. And today I want to tell you another story about mental health. So I have a neurological condition which is called attention deficit disorder, which is usually associated with rowdy little kids who run around, but it doesn't really reflect the condition. What it does really is it makes it very difficult to regulate my emotions. So you can say that by default, I'm not at all a resilient person. And there are some days which are good days, and there are some days which are not so good days. So I really had to work and to learn some skills to be able to regulate my emotions and to navigate a little bit more easily all the challenges that life throws in our way. And now I help organizations by teaching these very skills in the higher education sector, corporate sector, not-for-profit, and also to mental health professionals. So these are some of the organizations I've worked with. And I want to start with saying that we are all wired very differently. We all have different life circumstances, different upbringing, and it really impacts and influences the way we deal with adversity and with change. And nonetheless, regardless of how we are wired, we can still be able to learn some skills to navigate these circumstances with more efficiency. And of course, the most major change we've had to deal recently, and David was alluding to that a minute ago, is coronavirus, which completely changed the way we work, the way we interact and relate to each other. And of course, a lot of us may feel that way. I certainly do on certain days. So our roadmap for today is we're going to talk about our stress response. We're going to talk about mindfulness and neuroplasticity and a possible path to resilience. So starting with our stress response. So stress is the body's immediate reaction to, and that's a very important distinction, a perceived or real threat, challenge, or scare. And anxiety is an intense, excessive, and persistent worry and fear about everyday situation. And we can really feel how that's applicable to us right now. Of course, there is a role of stress and anxiety in our evolutionary biology, and this role is simply put to keep us alive. So it's designed to minimize threats to our survival and to optimize rewards or opportunities. And it has different components to it. The first one is an emotional component. And I'm sure we've all experienced this strong activation of a fight, flight, or freeze response. And we can see with the image of a tiger a minute ago that fight or flight would be appropriate responses, freeze, not so sure. But these are some of the reactions we have when we get strongly triggered or activated by a very intense stress. And this manifests at the level of our body by tension, hyperarousal, preparing a body for fight or flight. And it manifests also in our behavior by making us more reactive, more impulsive, and also more self-protective. And here we can see how that can impact relationships in our organizations and within teams. And finally, there's another component, which is the cognitive component. And it's linked to something we call the negativity bias, which is really this default tendency in the brain to look for the negative, to see the negative instead of the positive. And not only that, but to also have a wrong perception of the resources and tend to catastrophize every scenario. And here also we can see another implication of this level of stress and anxiety having a very strong impact on our decision making. Sorry, I think that's the problem. Right. So how do we cope with that? How do we deal with that? And this is how mindfulness and neuroplasticity enter the picture. So mindfulness is, very simply put, the ability to pay attention to what's happening in the present moment. And sometimes a drawing is better than a long speech. So I didn't make the drawing, but I think it is very relevant, and it certainly captures very well what I can experience when I take my daughter to the bar, where she's in tune of a direct experience of what's happening, and when my mind is geared toward the office and all my to-do list worries and anxieties. So there's been a lot of research in the last few years on mindfulness, and it has to, most of it do with the property of the brain called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the ability of your brain to rewire itself, depending on what you think, what you do, and what you pay attention to. And a great example is the London taxi drivers. And research has shown that taxi drivers who take the exam known as the knowledge, which takes 4 to 6 years to prepare, have to memorize the 25,000 streets of London and 20,000 monuments and points of interest, and to navigate mentally all these streets and points of interest. And so the research has shown an increase in the density of the gray matter in an area of the brain known as the insula. And the longer a taxi driver has been driving in London, the more important the density in this area of the brain. And it has profound impact on how it influences and can change our brain. And this is a meta-study which was done by the lab of Professor Yi-Wang Tang. And he reviewed 6,000 peer-reviewed articles on the subject. And the key benefits of mindfulness are attentional control, self-awareness, and emotion regulation, all of which enable self-regulation. And another way to say this is simply focus, clarity, and stability. So just to mention briefly some other studies. So this one has to do with the default mode network, which is the network in the brain associated with self-referential thinking, or to say it simply, the worrying mind, the mind that is constantly ruminating about the past or worrying about the future. Simple exercises of mindfulness actually deactivate this worrying mind. And also, and that's another study from the lab of Dr. Antoine Lutz, and this is a study done with a little device called the TER mode, creating a pain response. So mindfulness enables to have less anticipatory anxiety to what's going to happen, and also less lingering feelings in regards to an unpleasant experience or stress. So the possible path to resilience. In the program Search Inside Yourself, we talk about how and I'll briefly talk about that in a minute, how mindfulness can enable this resilience. But to start with, I'd like to introduce this very poetic definition of resilience, which is the ability to meet the disappointments and difficulties and even the catastrophes of our lives and bounce back. We can cope skillfully, effectively, and even gracefully. And if you want a more serviceable definition, we can say that it's our ability to recover and adapt to change. And it's both a mindset and a skill set that we can cultivate and develop over time. In the same way that you would do if you were going to a gym. In order to go to the gym, you have to have a mindset to go, and you create the habits, and the habits and the mindset sustain themselves. And a gateway to resilience is mindfulness. So a possible path to mindfulness is these 3 steps. And the first one is developing a sense of stability, of clarity through the practice of mindfulness. And in a minute, I'll introduce a very small practice that you can actually use. The second step is emotional resilience, which has to do with our relationship towards our emotion without over-identifying with them, and being able to relate to our emotion with a little bit of space, creating a buffer between us and our experience. And finally, cognitive resilience has to do with the way we interpret or we frame our experiences. And this has to do with what Dr. Martin Seligman called our interpretive style, depending how we usually interpret what happens to us. And of course, we know that there is this sort of dichotomy of the optimist person and the pessimist person who interpret what happens to them in a very different way. And the good news about this is it's actually trainable. We can train to frame things in a certain way so that it supports us. And when it supports us, it's going to really impact our behavior and our perception, which is crucial to how we relate to our coworkers, how we interact in the team, and how we can drive an organization with a clear mind and a cool-headed mind in a sea of changes, which is constant, especially at the moment. So I wanted to introduce a very quick, very simple practice, which is actually coming from first responders. And it's practiced by the firefighters in America, and it's called box breathing. So again, the purpose here is to, at the onset of a trigger, where there's a particular stress that is going to you, to redirect your attention in a very simple way through the act of breathing. And it's a sequence of 4 cycles of breath. With the first breath, we take a breath for 4 seconds. Then we hold it for 4 seconds. Then we release it for 4 seconds. And finally, we stay empty for 4 seconds. So what I propose is we can try it now. And so it's a very, very portable and very efficient little practice that we can integrate at any moment in our life. So I'm just going to guide it. So take a breath for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Release the breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. Stay empty. 1, 2, 3, 4. Take another breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Release. 1, 2, 3, 4, stay, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can continue. So I'd like you to notice what this very simple practice can actually do to reset you. And again, this is a practice used by the firefighters in the midst of action when they have to enter a building on fire and they need to reset their mind to be able to face very difficult, very dangerous circumstances. So this is just one of the many, many practices of cultivating inner calm. And I'll be, before we go to the questions, I'll be actually participating in the next conference with SDI in March. And if you want to learn more about how to manage your team with more resilience, how to make resilience team, you can actually also go to my website, Mindful Onwards. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, Jean-Christophe. That's fantastic. So, do you know there's an awful lot of stuff in there that probably over the last 5 years I've looked at more closely, because when you come out of a service environment, which is usually very busy, you know, your continual life is spent following processes, meeting SLAs, managing people, all that stuff. You rarely get the chance to really reflect and ask questions about, you know, the humanity part of what it is to be in an organization, to deliver service. And I've read an awful lot, and some of that just resonates massively with me. Certainly that negative bias, the perception, and how that relates to customer experience. That, you know, the customers actually, when they contact an organization in a specific, for a reason, the bias that they carry with them, and the bias that may be reinforced by a supplier organization, it's an incredible thing. It's an incredible thing. And I certainly, I read a book, which is a fantastic book. Leaders, was a couple actually, The Courage to be Disliked. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but it's based on some psychology, Alderian psychology, and it talks about the trigger points, and it talks about that, your own bias. So going into a meeting, expecting certain people to act in a certain way, and when they do, that reinforcing your bias. And I've only learned that recently, and it's an incredible thing, because once you know it, you can sort of, you can control it. You can be a little bit more emotionally intelligent about it. So that, some of that really resonates with me. Other books as well, which include some of the stuff you talked about, Leaders Eat Last, an obvious one, Simon Sinek, where they talk about what it is to be a human, the chemicals as well. I'm wondering, right, if you've got anything that you can talk about, maybe very quickly about Iki, I'm going to say this wrong, right? Ikigai, yeah, which is the Japanese stuff, or if that deep breathing thing you talked about, the biology behind that, the vagus nerve, and how that controls the body's heart rate and stuff like that. One of the two, relatively quickly. Sorry, I'd talk with this all day, man.
No worries, David. So maybe, and I think somehow we can relate both of them. So for the first one, I think it really relates to your values and your sense of deep aspiration. So the purpose being really to be in alignment with what you do, and this creates a sense of purpose, of fulfillment. And I'm not sure my Japanese is any better than yours, David, for the word ikigai. So it's really about this notion of being in alignment with your work, and that your work is in alignment with your inner values and resonate with that, which creates really a life of meaning and of purpose. In regards to the biology of the breath, there's actually a really good book which has been recommended to me yesterday. So I haven't read it yet. I've just downloaded it, and it's called Breath, and apparently it's revolutionary in how it really explains that when we think about well-being, we usually think about nutrition, we think about exercise. Now there is also more research done with sleep, and it seems that the fourth pillar of health and well-being is actually breath, and that we've been breathing wrong all along. So I'm really looking forward to be able to read this book and learn more about it.
Excellent, excellent. Do you know, again, it's another subject I could certainly talk about all day. Today's been very good so far, and I'm sure the rest of it will be about the content. But unfortunately, just the limited time that we have to go through and really explore it, right? So I'm looking forward to seeing you very soon at conference as well, JC, if I can call you that.